honor to introduce our next speaker, Rick Doblin. Rick Doblin is I mean, truly, if you've been to Burning Man, he's a hero of yours. You just simply may not have known him or had the privilege to meet him yet. Rick has devoted his life, and truly, I believe, risked his life for the benefit of humanity. Rick has spent his life on the scientific research of psychedelics. And if you do things that the government does not like, they will often imprison you and threaten you and potentially take away your loved ones and your livelihood. And Rick has been bold and brave and risked life and limb and family to commit himself to science and to making the world a better place by making the science of psychedelics available to all of us. And Rick, it's just an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for the work you've done in the world, and thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom here with us at Virtual Burning Man.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'll say two things. One, in response to Peter, is that while some of these drugs are new technologies, like LSD from 1938, but really discovered in 1943, and MDMA 1912, invented by Merck, but really these are ancient technologies that have been used for thousands of years and are really part of the human evolutionary story. The other part about the risk is just to say that I've always felt that it was riskier not to do this work. There was just an article in the New York Times today about Deepak Chopra talking about humanity committing collective suicide and how we're going in all these really dangerous directions on multiple different levels. And so it always felt to me like, even though there was some risk involved in what I was doing, the risks were much greater from doing nothing. And that's what really kept me going. So I really feel that I've been propelled by fear. But fear at a manageable level, the fear of what we're seeing with environmental destruction, the fear of the Holocaust, the fear of genocide, the fear of racism and fundamentalism and all of that. So that fear of progressive thinkers, being imprisoned or whatever, just felt like my situation was always so much easier than others who were in the midst of really suffering the weight of repression. I was here in the U.S. and free and supported by my family and supported by democracy. And so I always felt like I had the luxury of being able to take these risks, a luxury that many other people didn't have. And that's what really made me able to do this. And whenever things would get tough, I'd think, how hard is it that the DEA is blocking me or the FDA is blocking me compared to, people waking up in the Warsaw Ghetto or in the concentration camps or in China or whatever. So, whatever little things the FDA or DEA could throw at me was no big deal.
Thank you, Rick. I wanted to give I got so excited introducing you, I forgot to give your introduction so people can understand where you came from.
Okay.
So Dr. Rick Doblin, PhD, is the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS. He received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana. Rick studied with Dr. Stanislav Grof and was among the first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. And today he's going to be talking about MDMA, from therapy to criminalization, back to therapy in just 60 years.
Yes, it's now what I'm going to do is show a slideshow, a PowerPoint slideshow, but I'd like to know that people can interrupt at any time. I don't know how we would technically do this, but I'm thinking that we could wait for questions at the end, but I much prefer for people just to interrupt whenever they have a question. And I think that's much better. So can we manage that somehow? Or
so Rick, we've turned on the chat. And so if you're able to see the chat while you have your slides open, and so people can message you that way. Another thing is they can message me and I can read out the questions as they come in. I'm a little nervous about allowing people to unmute themselves because it can get a little noisy and chattery. What would you prefer? What would be best for you?
Well, I guess if they can just, well, if it gets noisy, then we can do something different. But I think if they just want to unmute and ask a question, and then if it's a problem, then they can just maybe text it to you or something through
Okay,
the
great.
chat, and then
So,
you can monitor that.
so for those in the Zoom, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt. Please be in a quiet space where we can clearly hear you and understand you.
Okay. All right. So now we'll do the screen share here. Let me get this, and then this will be. Let's see. Okay. All right. Now, can everybody see that? Is that?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So, so basically, what I'm going to tell a story from therapeutic criminalization back to therapy and licensed legalization. And I guess the first thing I want to just say is that 60 years is actually not that long when we think about it. You know, it's within one person's lifespan. For those of us that are parents that have had children, you know, you think when they're little, they're going to be with you forever, and before you know it, they're off on their own after 18 years or so. So a 20-year plan is not really that long. 60 years is not that long, and cultural change is slow. And you know, if you look at writings from the Bible or other things from thousands of years ago, it doesn't sound like we've evolved all that much. So, in case, what we can do with 60 years is not that much. It's not that long. So, Stan has talked about psychedelics are the study of the mind. What the microscope is to biology and the telescope is to astronomy. So I think that's really a very good point to begin. First off, Stan has been my mentor, and I'd like to, you know, honor him in that way. And he's mentored many, many other people. He's sort of the one that kept the flame burning for a long time. When psychedelics were criminalized, he went on to develop the holotropic breath work to show that with simple hyperventilation, you can produce a lot of the same kind of experiences that you can with LSD or other classic psychedelics. And like the telescope, where Galileo and others were imprisoned under house arrest, the things that you're able to see with these tools sometimes disrupt the basic cosmology or the basic understandings at the time. And so the telescope itself was very controversial. We don't think of it that way anymore. So this is, I think, the crisis that we're at, I'll just say, is this crisis of consciousness, that we have brilliant developments through our prefrontal cortex, through our mind, through our logic, through our rationality. You know, just the fact that we're talking to each other right now is like a magic trick almost of incredible technology and technological prowess. But we really don't have the emotional or spiritual maturity to deal with the technology that we have. So to give you just an oriented sense, this is a pretty psychedelic looking slide. It's from about a year ago. Maria Sabina, the mushrooms, ayahuasca, and why
Rick, Rick, sorry to interrupt. We see all your slides, not just the one you're on.
Oh, thank you for that. Let me
mode.
see. Oh, good. Okay, let me see if I can change that.
This is Jade.
That's very good. Okay, how's that?
Yeah, now we have it. Thanks.
Ah, great. Okay. All right, thanks. Okay. And then let me get rid of that. There. Okay. So this slide was created by the FDA. And I think that's really important to say that the FDA, up until recently, it's a bit of a tragedy, but up until recently, Trump has stayed away from politicizing the FDA. He's now politicized the FDA, the Center for Disease Control. But from 1992, when FDA opened the door to psychedelic research, really we've had a fair playing field, and it's been science over politics. And this is just to show that the FDA is now really getting excited about the potential of psychedelics. And so much so that they announced at this particular meeting, American Society for Clinical Psychopharmacology, that the FDA is going to be creating a guidance document for people who want to do psychedelic research. So we have the laws We have the regulations, and then one level below that is guidances, which are not you must do this, but best practices. And so the FDA is consulting with a bunch of us and others, and they're going to be developing this guidance document for how to work and develop psychedelics. Okay. Oops. Now, when we talk about, let's see, okay, there we go. We're talking about 60 years. I just want to go back to the very long-term perspective and talk about how that the Eleusinian mysteries from 1600 BC to 396 AD, these mystery ceremonies were celebrated every year. Sounds kind of strange, but you could be a woman or you could be a slave, or you could be a man, and you could still go to these things. They were sort of democratized in that way. It was under pain of death. You couldn't talk about what happened, but through more recent scholarship, it looks like it's ergot, which grows fungus on wheat and rye, and has got molecules very similar to LSD, that they would make these potions that people would drink. It's called Kikion. So what we're talking about so much is this mainstreaming of psychedelics, bringing psychedelics up from the underground, introducing them to our culture. But really what we're talking about is reintroducing them, that psychedelics were a key part of Western culture. Everybody that we know that's famous from the Greek times, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, all these people participated in these mysteries. And it was wiped out by the Catholic Church in 396 because it was kind of a competing spirituality, you could say. It was about direct spirituality. It's about each person experiencing their own connection to the divine. And what the church and the hierarchical authoritarian structures wanted to do was to be the mediator between you and the divine. And so the Eleusinian mysteries were wiped out in 396. When the conquistadors came over to North America, they killed a lot of the shamans who were working with peyote or mushrooms. So there's this kind of tragic part of humanity's story. But what we're talking about, in a sense, is 3,224 years from 1600 BC to where we are now, to the current psychedelic renaissance. And so I think it's important to think about how, when these kind of technologies of the sacred were suppressed, criminalized, massive numbers of women, witches were burned who were sort of closer to nature, closer to some of these tools. You could say that that helped facilitate the development of our rational mind, the suppression of the emotions and the irrationality. So the rational mind has now created miracles, as we've said, through technology, but now we need the other parts of our psyche to catch up, or else we're not going to be able to survive. Einstein said, "It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity." So that's the point I wanted to make. And that Edgar Mitchell said, "When we see our fundamental unity with the processes of nature and the functioning of the universe, as I so vividly saw it from the Apollo spacecraft, the old ways of thinking and behaving will disappear." So he's talking about this cosmic perspective, but it's very expensive to send people up in space. We'll see what Elon Musk and SpaceX can do, and others. But we need other approaches. So the important thing here to say is that it's not, when you take a psychedelic, you don't have a psychedelic experience. You have a human experience that the psychedelics catalyze. And you can have those experiences with meditation, with breath work, with going up in space and looking back at the earth as the wonderful thin blue marble in the sky. That there are sort of basic understandings that the ancients had that we've lost, and now we're trying to get back to them. This sort of validates for me this theory of change, why it was so important to bring psychedelics to the fore. Robert Mueller here was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He wrote this book, 1983. And again, you can see he put the Earth from space on the cover. And he talked about New Genesis shaping a global spirituality. And his thesis was that the United Nations is to help mediate conflicts between countries, but a lot of those conflicts are religious based. And so we need a global spirituality, which doesn't mean that it's one world religion. Just as the same way as the UN doesn't mean it's one country, it just means that we understand that religions are like languages, that there's an underlying need to communicate. We've found ways through evolution to do it with our voice, and we've created different coding systems for different languages, but it's not like English is better than German is better than French, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're serving a common purpose. They have differences in different emphasis, but fundamentally they do the same thing. And so that was this thesis. So Robert Mueller didn't say anything about psychedelics, though. So I wrote him a letter, and he responded to me, shockingly, and said he agreed with my approach, that psychedelics really were a tool to build this spirituality, and he would help try to bring back psychedelic research as well. And he did help in a couple of different important ways. And his view also was that mysticism is the antidote to fundamentalism. The sense of how we're part of the whole makes it so that we should be more tolerant to people that are doing things differently, and we should no longer be dehumanizing people or scapegoating them or trashing the earth and thinking the earth is separate nature, something separate from us, and we can just trash the earth. So all of this points to the necessity of bringing back psychedelic tools, because even though you can get to the same place without psychedelics, we could presumably get to a similar place if we took bunches of years and wrote each other letters instead of doing the Zoom call. So I think psychedelics can be accelerant at a time of crisis when that's really what we need. Now, modern research, this is done by Robin Card-Harris and others at Imperial College in London, sort of confirmed this approach, that this ego dissolution experienced during participants' most intense psychedelic experience positively predicted liberal political views, openness, and nature relatedness, and negatively predicted authoritarian political views. This is not to say that you couldn't take psychedelics and still be authoritarian, or still be right-wing, or still be willing to trash nature. This is sort of like a general trends that this kind of change can happen. And Robin has been criticized for even doing this research and putting it out. The concern people raised was, will people stop supporting the research? But I think we really have an obligation to honestly report what we find. And I think that we've other things that we're doing that sort of balances that out, that these kind of understandings. And it doesn't have to happen to everybody. You need to do these experiences in a supportive therapeutic way and then integrate them. But in general, this is the hope, that we can move as a species to a more spiritual place. Now, there's all these different ways of feeling the sense of global interconnectedness. On the right hand is global warming, and we're losing the polar bears, and hopefully they won't go extinct, but there's a good chance that they might. On the left end is the coronavirus, which never before in history has the entire world been so linked at the same time, with lockdowns, with understanding of the virus. But in the middle is some psychedelics. So I think that's a more preferable way to really get the sense of global interconnectedness in a safer way as well. And this is the spirit that I think we need to approach these things. Quest into the unknown. Back when I was at college, in 1971, I had a T-shirt. This is Mr. Natural from our Crumb, and so every time I wanted my friends to know I was tripping, I would wear this Quest into the Unknown T-shirt and put some glitter on my eyes. That was a way for people to know. But I think this idea of the excitement, I mean, so much time we spend frightened of the unknown, but we really need to be excited to quest into the unknown and see what we can learn. So MDMA was patented, first synthesized in 1912 by Merck. Really, they were trying to evade a competitor's patent to get to a certain drug. And so they developed a different synthetic pathway. And everything that they, every stop along the way in this new synthetic pathway was patented. But they weren't looking for MDMA. There's rumors that they were, looking for MDMA for appetite suppressant. That was not the case. And really, they didn't do anything with it for 15 years when their patents are starting to expire. And that's when they did the first preclinical studies with animals. And they didn't find anything interesting. You may have heard recently about the octopus study by a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins, where octopuses are solitary creatures, unless they're mating, which is very rare. But when you give them MDMA, all of a sudden they'll hang out with other octopuses. So they didn't get this kind of pro-social signal Merck did from the animal studies that they did, and they just abandoned it. Next time we know about MDMA, the Army Chemical Warfare Service is looking for mind control drugs. So 53, 54, they tested 8 different drugs for toxicity. And on the one hand was methamphetamine. And MDMA stands for methylene-doxymethamphetamine. On the other hand was mescaline. So of all the psychedelics, MDMA is most similar to mescaline. And mescaline is very warm, it's very body-oriented, it's got some loving feelings to it. And so MDMA, a good way to understand it is that it's kind of halfway between methamphetamine and mescaline, but it's different from both. So that unlike methamphetamine, MDMA, you can take it, you're alert, you can dance all night, you can be awake, but you're not frantic. You can sit still, you can meditate, you can be peaceful. You're not driven to clean the room up or whatever else you might be doing with methamphetamine. And unlike mescaline, there's not that much in the way of visuals or ego dissolution. It's more of open-heartedness. So these results were classified for another 20 years. So this really didn't impact the public debates, but it's the next time that we really hear about it in world history. 59, Merck conducted further studies, and yet again found nothing interesting. Now, in the mid-1970s, Sasha Shulgin, who was a hero to many of us, sort of the U.S. Albert Hoffman, he was looking for drugs that were potentially for spirituality and also for psychotherapy. His first psychedelic experience was with mescaline, and he had just a beautiful experience with that. There was a drug in the 60s called MDA, also known as the miracle drug of America, or the love drug, which was more like an MDMA LSD combination. But it was quite popular in the 60s. And when the Controlled Substances Act in 1970 came along and there was the backlash against psychedelics, all those drugs were criminalized. And so there was a lot of effort to try to tinker with the molecules and find some new things that would be valuable and legal. And so Sasha sort of rediscovered MDMA, experimented with himself, found that it had a lot of value. And his approach was very interesting. He and his wife, Ann, would test all the drugs themselves. If they liked it, they had a small group of 12 people, and they would give the drugs to that group of 12 people, and they would experiment and report on what different qualities they felt the drug had. And then if that group came to sort of a collective opinion, then what they would do is the next step, they would give it to Leo Zeff, so otherwise known as the secret chief. So Leo was the leader of the underground psychedelic therapy movement. And he'd mostly done work with Ibogaine starting in the 60s and LSD and other things. And so in the around 76 or so, when he's thinking of retiring, and Sasha told him about MDMA, he tried it and he thought, this is incredible. This has got an awful lot of potential. So he didn't retire, and he trained large numbers of therapists and psychiatrists. And around 500,000 doses of MDMA were used in these therapeutic and personal growth settings from mid-1970s to early 84. A lot of that was made at night at MIT by a bunch of the students there. So the MIT group was really important in the dissemination of the therapeutic use of MDMA. And it was called ATOM. So they didn't want to say what the exact molecule was. Now, some of the people that tried it in this context thought it was really great and they could make a bunch of money on it. More people should have it. And so it became ecstasy. It started being used in public as ecstasy in the Star Club in Dallas. And this is what really attracted the attention of the DEA. And they knew nothing about the therapeutic use of MDMA. But they could see ecstasy being used in public in different ways. And so this was also Nancy Reagan, just say no, escalation of the drug war. So it was clear MDMA was doomed. So what happened was then a bunch of us got together to prepare for the clash with DEA. And there was a series of meetings at Esalen and Big Sur with Dick Price, who started Esalen, sort of sponsoring them. And these were great meetings. We did a secret study with MDMA, a safety study that we didn't want to make public because we thought that that might attract the attention of the DEA, but we kept that private. This is a picture of me there right before I walked into the DEA to demand a hearing. They had proposed that MDMA become Schedule 1, and there's a 30-day period of comment. And on like day 28 or so, I walked into DEA headquarters, and we had great pro bono legal representation from lawyers in DC. We had incredible witnesses. We'd been sort of seeding various people with MDMA, Lester Grinspoon at Harvard Medical School, monks, rabbis, all sorts of people, so that they could have had a legal experience with MDMA so they could stand up once the DEA came. So we did get permission for the hearings, and we started winning in the hearings, and we started winning in the media, which caused the DEA to freak out. So in '85, they emergency scheduled MDMA. This is Gene Hayslip from DEA. So the hearings were still going on to determine the proper setting, but DEA freaked out. And the irony here is that the first move to criminalize MDMA was itself a crime, in the sense that the DEA did not have the authority to do this. So the people that got busted in this first year, once some of these lawyers figured out that the Attorney General had the power to emergency schedule drugs, but that had never been subdelegated down to the head of the DEA. So this move to the DEA, I think it is a good example of how this whole thing should never have happened, and it should have stayed legal the whole time. But the judge later came out with a ruling saying, yes, it should stay in Schedule 3, which means it would be illegal for recreational use, but legal for therapists. And that recommendation was rejected by the administrator of the DEA. And we sued the DEA twice in the appeals courts, won both times. And then the DEA finally, on the third time, in the context of some marijuana hearings to decide what's currently accepted medical use, they won the case. But it was clear that the DEA was going to do whatever they could. So in 1986 is when I started MAPS. The day before MDMA became illegal, Julie Holland, who's a psychiatrist, she and I, she wasn't a psychiatrist at that time, we took MDMA together. And I was carrying this big early, Apple computer with the image writer, and got a lot of exercise carrying these things around. And so while I was doing MDMA, I was writing a letter to the editor of a Business Week. They had an article about MDMA, and I was talking about how sad it was that it was going to be criminalized, and that would take it away from therapists. And then my last sentence was that, I hope one day that the therapeutic use can become, again, more than a dream. And when I went to print out this letter, the computer went haywire, and all it did is it printed out "become more than a dream." And so I saved that. I have that right here on my desk since 1985. Now, later on, as I was looking at my printer, I noticed that I had dropped a hit of blotter acid in the printer. And, as the saying goes, they like to say only losers use drugs. But of course, we've turned that around. Only users lose drugs. And so I had lost a hit of blotter acid inside the printer. So maybe that was the printer, tripping and telling me this message. But this has been an inspiration ever since to make the therapeutic use of MDMA become more than a dream. Now, from '86, when I started MAPS, to '92, the FDA rejected 5 different protocols to study MDMA. The first sort of glimmer of hope was 1990, when the FDA approved Rick Strassman to do a study with DMT. Although he had framed that DMT is the only endogenous psychedelic, it could be potentially linked to schizophrenia or so. And so it's sort of negatively focused. And we were trying to look at therapeutic use of MDMA. But they rejected all these protocols. a new group at the FDA took over in 1990 to regulate psychedelics, and they decided to put science first. This is a conference in 1990 where it was a benefit for MAPS, and Tim was there, and so this is Tim Leary, and I asked him, what advice do you have for us trying to make psychedelics legitimate and move them through the system, and what advice do you have for us who want to work with the government? So Tim said, fuck the government. I am so far past asking for permission for anything, but I'm glad you're doing it. And that's when he passed the torch to me for that stuff. So I really appreciated that. So we got the first approval with Charlie Grobe in 1992, the first phase 1 dose response safety study. And that took us through much of the 90s. We started doing PTSD work, first in Spain. Sadly, this was shut down by the Spanish authorities before it was over for political reasons. We had a lot of good media, and that alerted the Madrid anti-drug authority, so they shut the study down. But then we started in the US, we got FDA approval. It took us a really long time to get Institutional Review Board approval. Nobody would work with us. And I started the MAPS Institutional Review Board. I figured, look, we're an institution, we can have our own IRB. And at the last moment, before really going forward with our own IRB, I thought, let me give one more try to an outside agency if I could find one. And it turned out that there was one IRB that was named Copernicus IRB. So this gets us back to the telescope idea. I figured if there was any group that would be sympathetic to political pressure to stop science, it would be the Copernicus group. And as it turned out, they did live up to their name. They did approve the study. They said we had to buy them $1 million insurance policy to indemnify them in case any of the subjects sued them. They do all sorts of other stuff. But we now are still working with them. They were great, and so I'd like to really applaud Copernicus IRB. It took us 30 years from the start of MAPS to our end of phase 2 meeting. We've done 6 studies in Israel, Canada, Switzerland, and the United States. We presented our data to FDA, and this is basically the data. So the control group is therapy without active MDMA. And we are working with the hardest cases. We work with chronic, severe, treatment-resistant PTSD. And also, unlike a lot of research with PTSD, where they exclude people that have attempted suicide, we bring in people if they've attempted suicide. So the control group, 2 months after the last therapy session, this 23% no longer had PTSD. So this is really pretty good for the therapy. It was 42 hours of therapy over about 3.5 months. But when you add MDMA, it gets up to 56%. So it more than doubles, 56% at the 2-month follow-up, no longer have PTSD. What's even better though, is that this is the 2-month follow-up is where the FDA will compare the groups and decide if there's statistically significant differences. And that's what's going to be for approval. But really the challenge is to get it covered by insurance. So we've done a 12-month follow-up just to see if it's durable and it lasts, and 2/3 no longer have PTSD. People learn how to process difficult emotions, they learn how to process trauma, and they continue to move forward in their healing process. And of the 1/3 that still has PTSD, almost all of them have had clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms. If we could have given them a 4th MDMA session or waited longer between the sessions, they might also no longer have PTSD. It doesn't work for everybody, but it does seem to be very, very helpful. And what we learned in phase 2 is that the cause of PTSD is irrelevant. The SSRIs, Zoloft and Paxil, that were approved by the FDA for PTSD, they work better in women than in men, and they didn't work in combat-related PTSD. But our approach worked regardless of the cause of PTSD. We discovered that low doses, they do enhance the blinding to try to do a double-blind study, but they have an anti-therapeutic effect. What I mean by that is when you add low doses of MDMA to the therapy, people still get better, but they don't get as much benefit as if they had therapy without any MDMA at all. So the low dose activates them, but it doesn't really help reduce the fear, so they are more uncomfortable, and therefore it's difficult for them to make as much progress. We did demonstrate safety, and we showed medium to large effect size. We also used the same questionnaire to evaluate mystical experiences that's used in the LSD and psilocybin research, the mystical experience questionnaire, or the states of consciousness questionnaire. And this is just to show 0.6 is considered to be a full mystical experience, that or above. So the people with MDMA actually do score quite high on average, and quite a number of them are over the 0.6 level. And what you may have heard about the work with LSD and psilocybin in the 60s, and also the work now, is that there's a correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes. But we do not see that with MDMA. There is no correlation. So healing from PTSD, healing from trauma, the mystical experience has other benefits, but it's not a key element in the therapeutic process. So we reached agreement with FDA after another 8 months of negotiating on the phase 3 designs. We agreed on this. This is our phase 3 design. So you end up having 3 day-long 8-hour sessions. We use a male-female co-therapy team. And you either, everybody gets screened and enrolled. They're all meet all the criteria. And then you either get randomized to the upper or the lower. The upper is, the first session is 80 milligrams. We give 2 hours later 40 milligrams, half the initial dose, to extend the plateau, to have more time to work with people. The second session, unless there's some tremendous progress with the 80 milligrams or some concern about upping the dose, people will move up to 120 milligrams, followed 2 hours later by 60. But it is possible for them to stick with the 80. And the third session is also a little bit of a negotiation between the therapist and the patients. And in addition to these 3 8-hour sessions, where also people spend the night, we have 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 prep sessions before the first experimental session, and then 3 integrative sessions after each day-long MDMA session. So this is our therapeutic approach that we have agreed to with FDA, and we've agreed to do 2 100-person phase 3 studies. And so if we can prove statistical significance and no new safety problems come, then FDA will approve the drug. Now, comparing our results at that point, our phase 2 results with Paxil, with Zoloft, these are what's called effect sizes. And so MDMA is way much better large effect size than all the others. Zoloft, Paxil being the only drugs approved by FDA for PTSD. And because of that, we got breakthrough therapy. This is the most important designation that FDA has. You get more meetings with FDA. They expedite shorter timelines. It's really dramatic, you know, that when you get breakthrough therapy. And Big Pharma really likes it, but roughly 1/3 of the applications to FDA from pharma are accepted. 2/3 are rejected. They're not really breakthroughs. So this was a milestone. We've also had Compass Pathways, the for-profit, has now got breakthrough therapy for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And USONA has got breakthrough therapy, which is the nonprofit company for psilocybin for major depressive disorder. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the problem, this is now 2 years ago, there's over 1 million vets receiving disability for PTSD. Now, there's roughly 8 million people in America that have PTSD, according to the VA. Most of them are women. Most of them have been sexually abused or domestic assault or things like that. There's a bunch of other people that have had natural disasters, car accidents, operations. There's a lot of causes of PTSD. But just to give you a sense of, you know, more than 1 million veterans are disabled in some percentage from PTSD. And the VA spends roughly $15 to $20 billion a year in these disability payments. So you would think that the VA would be interested in paying for new treatments for PTSD, especially ones that are breakthrough, especially ones that have the results that we get. But that's not the case so far. And in 2017, $7 billion was spent on drugs for PTSD, sort of a market size. These are our phase 3 sites. We have 2 in Israel, 2 in Canada, and 11 throughout the United States. We've also started negotiating with the European Medicines Agency, and they've accepted the US data, accepted the design for the US, and so we're about 2 years behind in Europe than we are in the US. We're just starting the studies now to help train the therapists in Europe, and we're in 7 countries in Europe. one thing that I think is very important to say is that the EMA has said they want us to enroll refugees and migrants as well into our phase 3 studies in Europe, because that's just an enormous problem of so many traumatized refugees, and that you have a hard time assimilating into your new countries because of the trauma. So we're going to be doing that. We've done other studies, not just PTSD, and great with MDMA with social anxiety in adults on the autism spectrum, MDMA for life-threatening illnesses with Bill Wolfson here, the others, Charlie Grove and Alicia Danforth. Ben Sessa just completed a study with MDMA psychotherapy for alcoholism. The results are really, really good, but you need longer term follow-up. So he's going to be following it up longer term, but his 3-month results are excellent. This is going to be an interesting study starting up at Yale, where it's going to be the first one to take a PTSD patient under the influence of MDMA and put in a scanner. And then you have a neutral script and a trauma script, and you see how your brain reacts in real life. We've scanned people before and after treatment, and healthy volunteers have taken MDMA and been in a scanner, but there's never been a PTSD patient under MDMA in a scanner. And also, this is going to be very minimal support. There's going to be, you're only in a scanner for an hour, but for about 4 or 5 hours, the therapy team is going to be with you. There's only one integration session, one prep session. So in a way, this is as close as we get to seeing what does MDMA do without therapy, although there is a bit of support. Yes, let's see a question. Should I keep going, or do you want to ask a question?
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Hey, Rick. First of all, thank you so much for being a noble warrior who's been fighting this fight for more than 30 years.
Yeah.
It's very inspiring to see you being persistent, consistent, and in spite of the challenges that you face.
Yeah.
So the question that I have for you is, I know that MAPS are focusing more around healing, but personally, I'm more interested in how do you actually use it to unlock creativity, innovation, for the benefit of humanity. And I love that you go right after Peter Diamandis, right? So I'm interested in that visioneering aspect of things. If you can.
Yeah. So let me just say that through the FDA, we can only medicalize for disorders. So what you're bringing up, I think, is a very important point. Because we are a nonprofit, we've raised over 100 million in donations in the history of MAPS, which is, shockingly, astonishingly high. But we believe in drug policy reform. So to get at creativity, to get at personal growth, to get at finding your passion that Peter talked about, we need to have these drugs legal for people to access, not through medicine, not through religion, but through what we're calling a licensed legalization system. So we are strategically focusing our resources on medicalizing, but at the same time, we're really supporting the whole effort to move towards decriminalizing, like mushrooms are decriminalized, lowest enforcement priority in Denver and Oakland. Oregon's psilocybin initiative is going to be on the ballot. So because we need so much resources to do the medicalization, we've not looked at creativity or other things like that. But, and we're not going to be able to get that through the FDA. So I think what we really need is drug policy reform, and I'll get to this in a bit more, but we're going to talk about licensed legalization. That's where I think we need to get to. So, that answers that. We're working with eating disorders, also MDMA. We're about to start a study. We've done work with a lot of leading VA researchers. We're blending MDMA with stuff. We're paying for them just to educate them. This is cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, where conjoint is couple or dyad. One has PTSD, it affects the relationship, and both of them get MDMA. And Candace and I presented to the Boston VA a couple months ago, and she showed all the studies she did with developing this cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy just as a therapy without MDMA. And she showed the effect sizes. Then she showed the effect size from the 6 dyads that she worked with MDMA, and it was better than the others. So MDMA can really enhance a lot of other therapies. We're also paying, Ann Wagner was a protege of Candace to blend MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. Prolonged exposure is the most prevalent therapy in the VA. Barbara Rothbaum is going to do this at Emory, and then Edna Foa, who developed prolonged exposure, who about 11 years ago, she said MDMA is dynamite in the brain. I should just give it all up. I should go do VR and just forget about MDMA. There was a fellow named Skip Rizzo who was at the conference also in Jerusalem, 2009. And I went to Skip and I said, Edna says MDMA is dynamite in the brain. I should give it up. He said, and I should do VR. And he was doing VR stuff for PTSD. And he just laughed. And he said, if you have MDMA, you don't need VR because it brings your own story to the fore. There's approval now at the Loma Linda VA from the FDA and the Loma Linda VA. This may be, we've been trying for 30 years to start research inside the VA. These are young team of psychiatrists and PharmD. But they still have to get state of California approval and DEA approval. And then Rachel Yehuda we're working with at the Bronx VA to try to get approval there for a study of 2 MDMA sessions versus 3 sessions using our model. This is kind of like a cost-effectiveness study. You know, as I showed, people keep getting better at the 12-month follow-up, but people will get better more rapidly with 3 sessions, but maybe at the 1 year, if they just have 2 sessions, they will sort of learn how to process trauma enough. So maybe we can help people with 2 sessions more than 3, and that would cut out 1/3 of the cost. We want to do group therapy, and we may do something with Brian Anderson and others with LGBT people with PTSD, but it's really important for us to do group therapy. Now, and this is, I know we're running out of time, but I'll just say that the FDA is heavily influenced by the pharmaceutical lobbies. And so often when you do research, you develop your power calculations based on your preliminary data, you design your study for a certain kind of statistical power, and then you do the study. And then at the end, you examine the results. Did it work or did it not? In our situation, and others, all pharmaceutical drug development, you can do what's called an interim analysis for sample size re-estimation. You have a small unblinded data monitoring committee. They look at the data and they compare your actuals to your hypotheticals. And if your actuals aren't as good as your hypotheticals, then you can add more people to get statistical significance. So the bigger the effect size, the fewer people you need. The smaller the effect size, you need more people. But FDA approves not on the basis of effect size, but of statistical significance. And they figure they're doing groups, you know, maybe we'll figure out later it works more in this one group than others. So in any case, the interim analysis will tell you to continue the study unchanged, add more subjects to increase the statistical power, or stop the study because it's not working for futility. The FDA has declared 2 drugs breakthrough therapies for PTSD. One is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. The other is a drug called Tonmya, which is a repurposed sleeping pill from over 30 years ago, and it's by Tonix Pharmaceuticals. And they had their interim analysis in February, and they were told that they were failed for futility. We got our interim analysis in March of this year, and we were told the opposite. It's great. You don't need to add anybody. You're doing fine. Then FDA started coming to us because everything shut down because of COVID. And they said to us and other sponsors, you can shut the study down sooner if you like to. And we negotiated that we would end the study with 90 people instead of 100. So we have now completed all those 90 people. We have the data. And before the end of September, we're going to know if the first phase 3 study was statistically significant. If it's approved, oh, yes?
Oh,
Yeah.
am I interrupting you? I just wanted to get a question, and I know we're running out
Sure,
of time.
sure.
So first of all, just thank you so much for all your work. I'm a therapist, and the power and the usefulness of MDMA assisted is so needed, especially in the case of complex PTSD,
Yes.
which you referred to before when it's so intractable. Do you see, Rick? I mean, obviously you're a very visionary guy from way back when. Do you see in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, you guys have a plan for how this is going to roll out? Obviously, it's going to be, at least initially, or maybe primarily, or maybe even solely, in the therapeutic setting, which is fine because the people who need it will find their way to that. So do you see, you have a vision? I'm curious to see, you know,
Yes.
people are dying for these therapies, is what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
So the vision basically is that once it's approved, assuming we get it approved, then what these are called the REMS. This slide is about risk evaluation mitigation. So it's only going to be prescribed by people that have been through a training program in the therapeutic method, because the drug is not the treatment, it's the therapy really plus the drug. So it's only going to be by trained therapists, and it's only going to be under direct supervision, and it's going to be in these kind of clinic settings. But what I talked about cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, that's where it's one person has PTSD, but it affects the relationship, and both of them got MDMA. So I think the clinics are going to be starting to be set up. There'll be ketamine clinics, psilocybin clinics. People will be cross-trained. The therapists that they don't want to just be an MDMA therapist. They want to be a psychedelic therapist.
Absolutely.
They don't want to just be a psilocybin therapist or a ketamine therapist. So the therapists will be cross-trained in all these different modalities. You'll go to these clinics, and you will be able to, initially it'll be the patients, but then it can be the family members that can come into treatment. Cancer patients who are dying, they're struggling as well, but so are their family members. And I think that what will happen is over the next decade or so, thousands of psychedelic clinics will be set up, and that will change people's attitudes towards these drugs. The same way that medical marijuana has changed people's attitudes towards legalization of marijuana.
Absolutely.
So I'm currently suggesting 2035, when I think that we will have licensed legalization. And so I think the other part is this kind of drug policy reform is that we want people to have access to it on their own for self-healing. We've talked now about how a lot of people have trauma from COVID, but it hasn't progressed to PTSD. It's not chronic, but they're stressed. And so the sooner that you can treat somebody who's traumatized, the easier it'll be to treat them and the less expensive, but they might not rise to the diagnosis of PTSD. So we want to train people to do peer support, the same way at Burning Man, where we do the Zendo project with psychedelic harm reduction. So I think the rollout will be, first off, FDA approval, then these clinic settings, then expanding who goes to the clinics, and then eventually what it'll be, this licensed legalization idea, is that, and Tim Leary actually proposed this and others, it's like a driver's license, or you need to demonstrate that you can drive under supervision of somebody in the car. So for psychedelics, you will go to a clinic, it will be equitable because it'll be basically free, paid for by the tax money from all the people that are buying the drugs. And you have an experience under supervision, and then you get a license to do it. So I think alcohol is not regulated tightly enough. We think about all the drunk drivers who end up driving drunk and then they lose their driver's license, but they still buy alcohol and they still go out and kill people even though they lost their license. So
you think the world is readier now for psychedelics than say they were in the 60s? It seems like it was too fast in the 60s. The political structure, the economic structure, just the whole philosophy of who we knew ourselves to be as human beings. We weren't ready for it, and that's why there was perhaps such a huge backlash. Now,
I think that's exactly right.
Meditation, with yoga, with mindfulness, with spirituality in general, perhaps people like you and people like us who follow visionaries like you can find our way deeper, make the deeper inroads. Because one thing's for sure, Rick, there is no shortage of suffering in this world.
Right. The need is greater, but I think we have evolved as a species, as a culture, over the last 60 years. 50, 60 years, so that the culture is better prepared. I mean, you pointed it out. You can go to the YMCA and you can learn yoga. When yoga first came, it was like people are going to become foreign religions, and meditation was, Maharishi in robes and a weird thing. And so I think we are now poised on this potential opportunity to really mainstream. And I would say that even though Trump has talked about politicizing the FDA, the fact that we have the veterans who are being helped, I think we're going to make it. Yeah, that's my sense. I think that the psychedelics will make it through the FDA. They will be mainstreamed, and we will start creating these clinics.
Will you be at Horizons in New York in October? You'll be there?
I'm not sure yet. If I'll come in person. I'll just say my mom died a couple weeks ago, and so I went to the funeral. She died at 91, beautiful death, in bed at home with my brother and sister nearby. And so I did travel, but that was the first time I've left home in 5.5 months. So I may come to Horizons, but I'm not sure yet.
Well, thank you for your time. And I'm very, very grateful to know you and to be a part of it in the way that I am. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Rick, we are approaching time, and we actually have room in our schedule now. And so I want to be respectful of your time. And if you have time to finish your presentation, to take more questions, I have a fuck ton of questions to ask you about psychedelics if you're still available. So I'd love to keep you on as long as that fits your schedule.
Yeah. No, let's definitely do that. I have just a few more slides, but they basically say what I just said. But let's just go through them very, very quickly. So anyway, the FDA, let's see here. Okay, so this is our therapeutic approach, just to let people know, is that it's kind of inner-directed therapy. We work with following people, we support where they're going. We have 5 parts, online week-long training, looking at videotapes, therapy sessions. We've started doing that virtual for the first time, a couple times, and it's worked. A big part of our training is the opportunity for therapists to take MDMA legally in a protocol as a patient. So I think that's very important. I think that's optional, though. We don't want to require people to do a drug. And then they do role play with video that we supervise, and then they treat a patient under supervision. So this is our therapy training program. As a sign of progress, we do have a police officer who's a full-time psychotherapist, but full-time psychotherapist for the police. And he's going through our training program to give MDMA to police officers with trauma. So we're very excited about this as well. This is an example of a psychedelic clinic. This is another one, the clinic settings. It's going to be a jobs program. There's going to be 200,000 staff, I think, by 2030, 6,000 plus clinics. There's 6,000 already hospice centers. And what we've seen from marijuana is that legalization follows medicalization. And so this is a chart of American attitudes towards legalization of marijuana. And the main point here is look at this long period of time from where no progress made pretty much from 1976, 1996. 96 is when California and Arizona started the first 2 medical marijuana states, and then support kept growing. We're getting all these other drug policy reform things happening in Denver, Oakland, Oregon, and elsewhere. We're going to have a lot more harm reduction that we do from the Zendo, but it's going to be more widely distributed to other people. There'll be work with blending MDMA with Zen, with meditation, more spiritual use. This is an incredible study that Vanya did. University of Zurich, brain scan, lifelong Zen meditators. Zen has been traditionally anti-drug, but now these lifelong Zen meditators said this psilocybin experience really helped them deepen their meditation practice. Roland is doing a really important study at Hopkins and NYU with religious leaders from different traditions, taking psilocybin, trying to get back to that. Is there a common mystical core? And so I think we'll have this licensed legalization. So this is the more controversial thing I just want to say, is that for alcohol, 23 states, it's illegal for kids, for minors, to use alcohol, but parents can legally override the laws against minors and give alcohol to their kids. And I think that's the way it should be with psychedelics. That what we really need is to turn this back to parents. We don't want the government saying, no, you can't say this or that to your kids. So I think that this is the answer. It will be illegal for minors unless your parents or guardians want to give it to you. And then it'll take another 35 years, and we'll hopefully have a mystical, spiritual, psychedelic utopia. Island was Huxley's last book. It was about this utopian society, but it was destroyed at the end of the book by the oil companies coming and destroying the island. We saw that in the movie Avatar as well. So I think the answer here is that change has to happen from the inside out, from the heart of the system out. And that's what we're trying to do with medicalization. And that's the 60-year plan.
It's amazing, Rick. Thank you so much. A question that I think a lot of us have who have aging parents, well, all of our parents are aging if they're still alive, is the dementia. There's a lot of research that shows that just psychedelics provide a novel experience, and the idea of providing a novel experience can help grow new brain cells, promote neurogenesis. Great information from Paul Stamets on lion's mane and psilocybin to grow new brain cells. If we were interested in having our parents be more open-minded, so parents, you know, between 65 and 70, you know, the baby boomer generation, if we were more interested in having our parents become more open-minded, be willing to consider psychedelics as a potential therapy for their brains and or for trauma, where do you think a good place is to start that people of this generation would be open to hearing about and receiving?
Well, I'll start by saying that I failed with my own parents. I tried, you know, they don't drink, you know, both my parents are dead now, but I was unable to get them to try things. The only one time my mom tried marijuana when I was with her because she was in pain. So I think that MDMA is the place to start with parents because it's more general. And there's another strategy that I'd like to recommend. And I tried this with my grandmother. So this was in the 80s. My grandmother had unipolar depression, and my parents had a weird attitude toward the law. So they said that I could only give it to her if it was legal, and that we were unable to get legal permission. So what I did is the contact high. So I decided I would spend the day with my grandmother. I would take MDMA. I wouldn't tell her I was taking MDMA because that might distract her. And then we spent the whole day talking. And while it didn't cure her depression, there was just an amazing moment where she was saying that she had depression. She didn't want to live anymore. She didn't want to see her old friends. She didn't want to leave the house. There was no purpose in living. And she'd accomplished everything she wanted, and she was ready to die. So the MDMA gave me this moment to say, wow, you've accomplished everything you wanted. That's something to celebrate. You know, let's celebrate that. That's wonderful. You know, everybody has to die sometime, and you've accomplished everything you want. And she said, well, there is one thing. And so she went off into the other room and came back in a minute, and she brought a book and a note and a rose. And she said it was a wedding present from a guy that she had a romance with before my grandfather, and her parents didn't like the guy. This was taking place in Israel, in Palestine, 1924, and they shipped her back to America to break up the romance. So I always had all these Israeli relatives. I could never figure out, why is my branch of the family in America? So this came out under MDMA. So I would encourage for your parents, I think you're totally right. I mean, the idea of a psychedelic retirement, people get more interested in death, more interested in meaning of life and purpose near the end of their lives. So psychedelics at end of life are tremendous. But if your parents are reluctant, I would say start with MDMA, and then the next step would be, if that doesn't work, take it yourself and just hang out with it.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I also wanted to ask you about microdosing. I forget who said it, that microdosing, specifically LSD, is one of the most under-researched, underutilized uses of that psychedelic medicine. And if you just want to riff on microdosing of any psychedelic and the benefits that you've come across, that would be super helpful, because I know a lot of people want to enhance their cognitive performance or enhance their creativity, and maybe don't want to dip so deep into the psychedelic state on a regular basis, but that microdose provides an avenue or a potential way to do that without going to hardcore nootropics like Adderall, for example, that has like a heavy cost on the body. So I'd love it if you would talk about microdosing.
Yeah. So there's a fellow named Shlomi Raz that started a psychedelic company called the Aldous Benefit Corp. And, you know, I started by talking about Aldous and how that's the origins of Western culture and the origins of psychedelics. But Shlomi with Aldous Benefit Corp wanted to study LSD microdosing for creativity. And they actually spent a bunch of money and did a study, and it didn't work. And what I meant by it didn't work is they couldn't show a difference between the control group and the group that got the microdosing. Their explanation was that there's kind of a ceiling effect, that these tools that they were using to measure creativity weren't so sophisticated, and that the healthy volunteers were still pretty good at that, and they couldn't find a difference. So they have pivoted to now do sort of looking at physiological effects. LSD and other things can reduce inflammation. They're looking at physical disease. Nevertheless, I think that psychedelics microdosing can increase creativity. and it can be very useful. And I also know some people that use it for depression. But my main preference, the idea is that we want to make people free of drugs. So if you have or free to go back to drugs for other reasons. So if it's for a clinical indication like depression, I would much rather see a few macro doses than, trying to treat it with microdosing, because that's not different from what pharma is doing, just controlling the symptoms. We want to get to the core, try to unlock those patterns and those problems, and then make it so that you're free of those. So I'd say microdosing for therapeutic indications is not something that I'm that interested in, or there isn't that much research to demonstrate that it's really good. But microdosing for creativity, I think everybody needs to, if you want to try it, I think, try it among yourselves. And we know that there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley that do it, that talks about creativity. And so I think that it can be used. Jim Fadiman, for anybody that really wants to learn more about it, just search Jim Fadiman. And he's been collecting anecdotal reports, and there are so many reports of people that talk about benefits from microdosing.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. So if you have a question for Rick, please unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm gonna keep on. This is such an area of great interest to me, and so many people in the Burning Man community, because psychedelics have been a medicine and a way to make the art behind me live in a very profound way. And so just on the microdose pathway, are you familiar with very much? You mentioned they didn't find a difference in one specific study. Paul Stamets talked about taking a microdose for neurogenesis. So is there any good research on the benefits of microdosing that you're aware of?
I am not. I mean, it doesn't mean that there isn't, though. But I am not aware of that kind of research. Really, it's a little bit difficult when you think about trying to do formal microdose studies, because you'd be taking the drugs at home. The psychedelics, the DEA has to approve the research, and they want the drugs to be administered under direct supervision. So the idea of giving somebody a pile, here's a month of microdosing LSD, take it home and do it one a day, they're worried somebody will take all of them at once or sell it to their friends. So it's going to be very hard to do a FDA, DEA approved microdosing study for a period of months. You could make people come into the clinic once a week, something like that. We've had to do that with some of our marijuana studies, but it's very annoying to the people who are subjects in it. So I'm not aware of those kind of studies having been done. But for anybody that wants to look at it, you look at clinicaltrials.gov. So it's now a rule that if you're doing research like this, you have to announce it in public and post a lot of stuff on clinicaltrials.gov. So you could put in LSD microdosing and see if there's anything, but I don't think that there is.
Do you want to ask a question? Thank you. Thank you. Is there anything that people can take to, I've heard about people taking things that increase serotonin, for example, to soften the potential downside after taking something that affects serotonin, like MDMA. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. So
great.
The very beginning of our work with FDA, this was now again 1990, 1992. People were talking about all different things to try to make it come down easier. But the FDA said to us, and I agreed with this, which was you first need to find out what's the actual risks without it before you start assuming you need it. And so, you hear about the Suicide Tuesdays or all these things that ravers talk about. We don't see that with MDMA therapy. There's not this post-MDMA crash. And I think some of the main differences are that we do it during the day, not at night. People sleep at the night. They're not mixing it with alcohol. We have them rest the second day. So it's very important to think about this as a 2-day experience. So we don't see that. At the same time, I do believe that if you were to take 5-HTP, I've heard a lot of stories about that. but you know, I've taken MDMA about 125 times maybe in my life since 1982, and I don't preload or take anything afterwards. What I think is most important is just to rest afterwards, integrate, think about it, lie around in bed and sleep. You know, I think that's preferable, but I do think there's a lot of stuff that people have taken, particularly 5-HTP, but we don't see it necessary.
What about the cleanliness of the drug or of the medicine? Because in the scientific laboratory, a lot more certain about the quality of what they're getting versus on the street. A friend of mine works at FestMed, which is a volunteer organization that tests drugs at festivals, so that way people can know what it is that they bought. So, you know, test for the active ingredients, and a lot of things that are sold as ecstasy or MDMA or cocaine are not what it is that they say they're selling. There's something different, or they're mixed with something else to heighten the effects. So how much do you I know this would be basically impossible to know, but do you think that could be a confounding factor, that the purity of what people are taking and then reporting this major crash could be from mixing it with amphetamine, or mixing it with, or that the drug isn't as pure as it is in the laboratory?
Yeah, I think that could be definitely a factor. So I'll just refer people to what's called the ecstasy pill testing program. So Bob Wallace was one of the first 11 people, I think, hired at Microsoft. And this is now back in 25 years ago. He was very concerned about the purity of drugs that people were taking. And so he donated roughly $80,000 to MAPS for us to pay for a lab. There's only one lab in the United States that has a DEA license to accept anonymous samples. It's called Drug Detection Lab in Sacramento. And so we partnered with Arrowhead and DanceSafe to do ecstasy pill testing program. And so you send in your pills, and you have a little code number that you assign to it, and then they put a report on the internet what it is. So you can send it in anonymously, and you can get the results anonymously. And a lot of the stuff that people claim is MDMA has no MDMA in it at all. There's an awful lot of adulterated drugs. So that's part of the drug war's intention, which is to make it riskier for people to do these drugs, which is, you know, upside down. We should be trying to do harm reduction and offer support for people to do these. So people need honest education, which we don't get. We get propaganda in a lot of places. We need pure drugs, which we also don't get. And so we need these pill testing programs. They're more used at festivals in Europe. Here in the US, that hasn't really been used much. But if you do have pills that you think are MDMA, you can go to Arrowhead and look at the ecstasy pill testing program, and they'll subsidize the cost of some of them, and then you can figure out what it is.
Thank you. I so agree about the about what you just said. It reminds me of the needle exchange program. So, so some people are very opposed to needle exchange, and I was in high school. Then someone gave a talk on needle exchange, like, "Hey, listen, first of all, it reduces heroin use, and it protects against the spread of HIV and AIDS." It's like, listen, perfect. You persuaded me. Those are the two things I was concerned about. Needle exchange reduces both of those. I'm in. Nothing else matters. Then you look at Canada. Now they have these programs where you can go in there. If you're a heroin addict, they'll actually inject you with heroin, and a nurse will do it. And that way, you know, you're getting safe stuff, and you actually get a shower, maybe a meal. It's a lot safer way to get the drugs if you're an addict.
Yeah, well, the heroin maintenance programs are very interesting in that, you know, so much of the problem is caused by impure drugs or drug seeking, so that people can have stable lives while they're doing heroin, and they can have families, they can have jobs. And that's a much better approach than criminalization and trying to throw them in jail. I'll just mention that Ibogaine is another psychedelic that we're trying to look into. It's really good for helping people go through the withdrawal process from opiates, and also to spiritualize them as well, and do the psychotherapy about why they're trying to escape into drugs. So Ibogaine is one of our top priorities. I see this question from Dan about why does it appear that MAPS is more focused on MDMA than psilocybin? Well, the answer is because we're more focused on MDMA than psilocybin. MDMA was, it takes a lot of money. I mentioned we've raised over $100 million. You know, we still need to raise another 30 million more to take MDMA to Europe and around the world. We'll probably start that in October, that next fundraising campaign. And there are other groups that are doing psilocybin. You know, Compass Pathways is the for-profit, USONA is the nonprofit. So I feel that there's no lack of resources going into psilocybin.
And Rick, we have a question here in the comments. How useful do you think science type sites like or apps like microdose.me are? Or if,
I think they're very good. Yeah, I think they're very good. There's a lot you can learn, and there's an enormous amount of underground knowledge that isn't really being collected, and so they're trying to gather that sort of information. And Johns Hopkins, Roland Griffiths, their team has been doing more and more survey work as well about just gathering information, why people use these drugs, what kind of side effects they have, what they learn from it. So there's just a lot of sort of citizen science. None of that will work with the FDA. So I think that's the, you can learn a lot of important things, but it's not going to help change the legal context to get these drugs approved.
Thank you.
Oh, let me see. So let's see what Andy has to say. Okay. Do you want to explain your question instead of just type it?
Yeah. I'd love to.
Okay.
So since our speaker series last year at Brunners, and in general, I've just been doing a lot of kind of public advocacy work for psychedelics to the people who have never even thought that they would cross this threshold. And so it's preaching not to the choir. And I have not found a place of confidence from where I can advise people to start. So I wanted to know what you would recommend in that respect.
Well, first off, I would say that it's really important to empower people to make their own decisions. So this idea of advising them to start is like you saying you should do this, and the flip side is you are the government saying you shouldn't do this. So I think it's just, you have to be careful about that. So that I think a better way to phrase it is, here's what you might expect if you start. If you choose to do this, these are some of the things that could be happening for you. There's a lot of people that don't want to break the law. Now, when I was 18, back in 1972, I was a Vietnam War draft resistor. And, it was very clear to me that what's legal and what's moral are two wholly different things. And so the legal system has never been the guide for me. It's a guide about what people think is wrong and right. I have to consider it, but I've never think that it's like the final word on things. But a lot of people are worried about that. So that's really difficult. But I think that for people that are suffering from something, and I think that you can share with them the research or the possibility, or that, but the other part is that it's the context and it's the support. So, you could offer to sit with them yourselves. You could say, you could take it in this safe context. I'll not do it, and I'll be there to kind of, you could learn from our treatment manual, from Zendo programs, things like that, about how to help them. And I do think it makes sense to start in a gradual way. So a lot of times people will say, well, I'm scared of an overdose, or I'm scared of losing control. And so I'd say in between microdose and macrodose, there's like a third dose or a half dose. And, so you don't have to rush it. That's one thing I think you could do, is say to people, hey, maybe we'll consider it a wasted day, and it's hard, but just take a third of a dose and see what happens. And maybe nothing will happen. It's still not wasted because you've learned a little bit, and then next time you can sort of inch up higher. So I think that can really work for people. And for those people that have never taken it, I think one of the real arguments that I use a lot is that we all have dreams at night. We have this natural shift into a different state of consciousness, and it's part of a normal, healthy thing. And then you start getting them to talk about their dreams, or do they ever remember dreams, or do they ever have dreams that were important to them? A lot of people wake up in the morning, they rush off, they don't even think about their dreams, but there's a lot of content in dreams. And I guess I would say that you're the best example, so that sharing your own stories, or if they see that you're reasonably happy and that they know that you use these things. So I'd say personal disclosure about your own experiences is probably very persuasive to people. but also you catch people where they're suffering. I mean, that's like the one time I got my mom to smoke a joint was when she was in pain. You know, the only time. But you catch people where they're suffering, and then if you can somehow or other create a safe context for them, you know, and usually that can just be, you know, you'll be with them and you won't do it, and you'll just watch over them while they try it or something like that. But we have to be careful not to be proselytizers, like you should do this. So even, you know, part of our training program is MDMA, the protocols for MDMA to take, for therapists to take MDMA as part of their training. But what we say is that it's an option. It's not required. If you want it, it's there, but it's not required. And so we want to welcome skeptics. We want to welcome people who might not ever want to do it into our training programs, and that's worked really well. And in the end, most everybody volunteers.
Rick, you mentioned worst case scenarios. What is the worst case scenario? Because there's a lot of disinformation. For example, people think, I remember, if you remember the movie Forrest Gump, there's a scene where Jenny, Forrest's, you know, the girl he grew up with, who he ends up falling in love with, you know, she's about ready to jump off a ledge, and it looks like she's just taken LSD, but we don't know, but that's kind of like, that's like one of the theories. I asked my parents, because I was maybe 13 at the time. They're like, oh yeah, you know, people could take LSD and then think they could fly, and then they would jump off buildings. Or people take LSD and they or take so much they lose their minds. Or people take MDMA so many times that they reach a state of anhedonia. They reach a state where they can't experience pleasure because their brain is just, their receptors are shot. And I don't know how much, I don't know what's fact or fiction. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on what is the worst case scenario from a very science-based standpoint.
Okay, well, we'll start with MDMA, then we'll go to the other things. So that it's very true what you just said. There are people that can overuse MDMA and then they get anhedonia. I've had friends do that. And what they ended up needing to do is not use it for 3 or 6 or 9 months in order to kind of get back to a new baseline. But that was after a lot of heavy use. The thing about MDMA that's got some built-in pharmacological safeguards is that, you know, normally when you develop a tolerance to a drug, your next approach is just to up the dose. That works with amphetamines, that works with alcohol, that works with a bunch of different drugs, opiates. But with MDMA, it doesn't. You don't get that open-hearted feeling. When you want to try to up the dose, you just get more of the speedy parts. You don't get the open-hearted. So, and also what we see with MDMA, which is unlike other drugs, is that over time, the effects seem to fade somewhat for most everybody. There's some diminishing return over time. Maybe it happens after 40 sessions or 50 or 20 or different for different people. So we don't see people that have years of sort of heavy ecstasy abuse or heavy MDMA abuse. And I think that's because of these pharmacological safeguards. But MDMA, sometimes people can overheat and die. You know, they take it, they get hyperthermia, they dance, they don't drink adequate fluids. Occasionally people are drinking fluids, but they don't understand that they should be drinking electrolytes, not just water. So people have died from drinking too much water, called hyponatremia. I think the more important kind of problem is people who have emotions come up, difficult emotions, and then they try to suppress them because they don't feel safe. And then you end up worse off. So stuff that's varied, you've kind of got a balance. It's not so good. It's not that working that well, but at least you're balanced. And then you take MDMA, stuff comes up and you're like, hey, my friends don't want to talk about it. And I'm just going to stuff down this remembrance of prior sexual abuse or whatever. And you could be emotionally worse months later because of that, where you had the opportunity to heal, but you didn't actually fully explore it. The worst case with psilocybin and LSD is there have been people that have really gotten into these very panic states and have killed people or killed themselves. So that's happened. And oftentimes the ego, one of the concerns is that the ego dissolution, we're so wrapped up to our ego. Our ego is our self, who we are. And so when the ego is being dissolved through these classic psychedelics, through what's called the default mode network, kind of our sense of self is weakened, people misinterpret ego dissolution with physical death. And sometimes it can be so scary. People have either killed themselves or sometimes killed others. It's extraordinarily rare. So, we're talking about worst case. But it's good to, if you're doing psychedelics, to have somebody that's not doing psychedelics to watch over.
So I have a funny story about someone not overdosing on LSD, but theoretically. So she was 22 years old. She was down in Mexico at some big festival, and she had a dropper of LSD. And I think she ended up swallowing what was rest of the dropper, which she then realized was maybe 20 hits or so. And she was, so let's say it hits 100 micrograms, so 20 times that. And I said, "Why'd you do that?" She said, "Well, because I was a drug addict, and that's just how I operated." And then she said, I said, "What happened?" She's like, "Oh, I was up for 2 days, and it was insane." She's like, and then at the very end, I ended up having a beer, and I had to go to the hospital because I was dehydrated. And I thought that was amazing. I have trouble thinking of very many controlled substances where if you take 5, 10, 20x the prescribed dose, that you're not potentially, well, I mean, that you're not seriously hurt. I took, there's a brain booster called Huperzine A, and I missed a decimal on the measurement. And so I took 10x what I thought I was taking. I was sick to my stomach and I had a headache for a day. And I was grateful I didn't seriously hurt myself, but the idea that you can take large amounts of these things and not hurt yourself long term is really fascinating. Versus, if you take a large dose of Advil, Tylenol, you can kill yourself. You can do permanent damage to your liver. And so I wanted to ask you about the macro dose. Is there a point where you take, I don't know, if someone just really misunderstood what it is that they were taking, that they had a serious would it be an acute overdose?
I don't think we know of any cases like that where it's happened with LSD.
Really? That's a nice data point to not have.
Yeah, there's a story about how the CIA was giving a bunch of LSD to an elephant, and the elephant fell down and died. And what actually happened was that when the elephant fell down, they were worried about it, and they gave it all sorts of overdose of tranquilizers, and then it died from that. So there really is LSD. First off, you give it in millionths of grams, so it's very small. If you take a whole bunch of LSD, you're not going to hurt your brain. The drugs that get more and more involved with your body, psilocybin is a little bit more embodied. Mescaline is a little bit more embodied, but they're very safe. So the thing about, I'd say the difference between MDMA and the classic psychedelics is that the classic psychedelics are safer physiologically, but they're riskier psychologically. And MDMA is safer psychologically, but riskier physiologically. So with MDMA, it increases blood pressure and temperature. So if you take a massive amount of MDMA, it could be very problematic from a heart perspective. But it's not like it's very near, it's not like twice as much of a normal dose as then you're in big trouble.
Do you know what the dangerous threshold is, where if someone, is it 10x a standard dose that it becomes potentially dangerous for the body or for the brain, let's say for MDMA?
Well, it really depends on the strength of your heart. So if you've already got a compromised heart, then it's more dangerous than not. So, these kind of risk assessments have to be done on an individual basis.
Okay, but for general, if I were discussing with my parents and say, listen, this is really safe. Generally, here's the story. This dosage is very safe in scientifically controlled studies, and doses up to this amount are safe for healthy individuals. Over that, it can get dangerous for your heart. Do you know what some
I really don't know. I wouldn't be able to do that. So one of the things that we have to do for the FDA, it's called the investigator's brochure. What that means is it's something that the sponsor MAPS creates for the investigator, and it's a summary of the world's literature scientifically about MDMA with an analysis of the different kind of risks. And so we've been working on this for a long time. So just 2 days ago or 3 days ago, we published on our website the 12th edition of the MDMA investigator's brochure. So if anybody is interested, you go to the MAPS website. On the top, it says research. You go down to MDMA, and at the bottom of the MDMA page, it'll say investigator's brochure. So you can just download that. You can get all sorts of information about all the different risks and everything that we know about what's published.
Thank you. That's really helpful. MDA versus MDMA. Those are they're very close. I was wondering if you could explain the difference to people.
Yeah, well, chemically, MDA, methylene dioxyamphetamine, MDMA is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. But MDA is a pretty great drug, and it's more like an LSD MDMA combination.
That's such a great quote. MDA is a pretty great drug.
Yeah, it's exciting, and a lot of people that get this tolerance to MDMA, not because of the dose, but because they've done it a bunch, they do MDA, and it seems like you're doing it again for the first time. So it operates differently enough so that it sort of overcomes the cross tolerance. And there's now this for-profit company called Mind Medicine that's going to be starting a study with LSD MDMA combination in Switzerland. And so MDA is a little bit like an LSD MDMA combination. MDA has a bit more effect on the heart. It's a remarkable drug, and it was used in therapy. I think even though it was once MDMA was criminalized, they're both illegal. Underground therapists tended still to work with MDMA rather than MDA. You're a little bit more grounded. You're a little bit more able to deal with fearful emotions. So I think one question I'll just say, and then
on that path, MDE. Can you tell us about MDE?
Yeah. So there was a whole bunch of people in the 90s, particularly in Germany, that were trying to do research with MDE and saying, oh, it's better than MDMA. It's not as neurotoxic or whatever. MDE is somewhat similar, but in no way is it as deep as MDMA. It doesn't have as much the euphoria type. So I think you could safely just forget about it. There's other drugs that are called 3-MMC, 4-MMC that are worth checking into that are like MDMA. So, science is marching on, and maybe one day they'll even develop a better one than MDMA. I haven't taken it yet. I'd be glad to volunteer for research to try it. But I think that, they're all a slightly different take on things. But, there's a really interesting documentary about Sasha Shulgin called Dirty Pictures. And what they meant by dirty pictures is pictures of molecules. He sort of talked about that. But in it, he said he's made hundreds of molecules. And of all the ones that are like MDMA, he said MDMA is the best. So it will be interesting if people can improve on it somehow or other.
Is this in the book Stealing Fire? Because I remember there's a chapter on Stealing Fire about a psychedelic scientist, and he would try the new things. Is that the same person?
I'm not sure that section of Stealing Fire. I'm not sure if that was about Sasha, but probably.
Okay. So MDA gets your strong recommendation. That's a great drug. MDE, not so much.
No, it's like a pale shadow of MDMA, I'd say. Wow. Whereas MDA is something different. Okay. It's something different. We'll talk about 2CB for a second. 2CB. So Sasha invented 2CB. My first experience with 2CB was so great that I decided at the end of the day, I'm never going to take it again. So I would always have that memory of that one experience. Now, of course, after a while, I took it again. But 2CB is a little bit more, again, in this direction of MDMA LSD combination. Very energizing, very open. It has not been used so much in therapy. It was the people that marketed ecstasy in the 80s, they were thinking, because MDMA was called Adam, and the nickname for 2CB was Eve. And so they were trying to decide whether they could make a bunch more money by marketing 2CB as well. And so a bunch of us went to them and said, we don't think it's a good idea. 2CB is effective in, milligrams. So, 15 milligrams, 10 milligrams, but you could easily make a mistake and you could get more than you wanted of 2CB. And it's also more like LSD. You're more loss of control, more ego dissolution. It is a very interesting substance, but we advised them not to market it. We just thought that they would be creating all sorts of problems. And in the end, they decided not to market it, which I was really relieved to see.
They to market it? Who would they be?
Is the, they call it the Dallas group, the Texas group, the ones that made MDMA into ecstasy.
Okay. It made MDMA into ecstasy. And can you describe what that is? MDMA.
Oh, what I mean is that the MDMA ecstasy was MDMA. They just called it a different thing. And
I thought it was fused with like amphetamine or something.
No. Ecstasy was meant to be, okay, so ecstasy was pure MDMA. It was just another name for it. Later, because of what we talked about before, about all these impure drugs, then yes, it got to be mixed with amphetamines or caffeine or all sorts of other things. But ecstasy was meant to be pure MDMA. For a long time, it was pure MDMA. Sometimes people will sell you ecstasy and it will still be pure MDMA. But the group that did that in the 80s really was looking to expand their market. And I think they made a wise decision not to go ahead and market 2CB.
So MDMA, I've heard of this concept that sex and physical touch is so pleasurable that if you have sex while on MDMA, that it almost like it dwarfs anything else you've experienced, and you never want to have sex again without it. I know that's an extreme perspective, but is there a harm in having sex on MDMA? Could that be detrimental because it's such a flood of neurochemicals?
Well, no, that sounds great actually. But it's very hard to have sex as a man. It's hard to get an erection. It's hard to have an orgasm. So a psychiatrist, so I think those are stories that are mostly made up. And so Dr. Torsten Passy is a German psychiatrist. And so this is a really good thing, I think, to think about MDMA. What he did was he looked at the hormonal release and various other aspects, and he said that MDMA is most like the post-orgasmic state. So it's not like the pre-orgasmic state or the sexual desire in that way. It's more like you're satiated, you're feeling wonderful, warm, you're close. MDMA is more nurturing, more emotional. Yeah, a lot of people don't want to have sex on MDMA. They want to sort of talk heart to heart, and maybe near the end of the sessions, you could have sex. It becomes easier, and it is great. But I think this understanding of MDMA like the post-orgasmic state is the really good way to understand what MDMA is.
And so can you explain what the chewing is with MDMA? I've seen people who have taken what I think was MDMA, and then it looks like they just are moving their jaw all night. They want to chew gum, like they want to involve their mouth.
That's a physiological experience that people have from MDMA sometimes, and it depends on the dose, of course. But what that actually is, why that's caused, I'm not exactly sure, but that's a common side effect. Even in the research that we do of MDMA.
Excellent. So we have a question here. This is from CK. I've only had 3 experiences, but I haven't had a transformative experience either on MDA or MDMA other than keeping me up all night. Any thoughts?
Well, the next time I would suggest taking it during the day. Taking it like 10 or 11 in the morning, your energy's all going in one direction. You're not using some of it to keep you awake when you would be sleepy. But, we're all different. So, different people respond to different things. And a lot of it has to do with how social you're trying to be. I mean, if you're with a bunch of people and you're relating to them a lot, you're not as focused internally. So I would say, a good way to think about a transformative experience with MDMA, at least to explore it, either MDA or MDMA, is take it by yourself, have somebody maybe that's there that's not doing it. Lie down, close your eyes, and just have an inner experience rather than a social experience. And maybe that will be transformative, or maybe you've transformed enough and you don't need any new transformations.
That's perfect. You're perfect.
But it's unique to different people. But I'd say that just when you're describing it as keeping it up all night, it's a social setting. I don't know if you're mixing it with alcohol or anything, but I'm saying take it by yourself during the day, somebody to watch over you, and just go inner and see what happens.
And now, what do you think about food and psychedelics? Is it good to fast beforehand? Is it good to have, fruit beforehand? I've heard vitamin C helps with the absorption. I think it was of psilocybin. I don't know. Can people get upset stomachs from these things? What's a good way to prepare the body for a medicine journey, and a good way to nourish afterwards?
Well, when you hear about ayahuasca, all sorts of dietas that people use. But what we say to people is not to have anything after midnight. So they come in around 9 in the morning. We give it to them around 10 in the morning. We say, if you want to, you can have a very light breakfast, but really, ideally, it'd be, you can drink a lot of fluids, but not to eat anything after midnight. So in general, I think it is. One of the funny studies that the FDA is going to require us to do is called the food effects study. So we're going to have to do studies. These are safety studies, healthy volunteers, and it's also known as the hamburger study. They want to compare what happens when people take it on an empty stomach and what happens when they take it after eating a greasy hamburger. And so that would be a fun study to volunteer for. It'll be UC San Francisco. But in general, I think it's good not to have a heavy meal, to take it on an empty stomach if you can.
And then what's good to eat afterwards? Let's say that evening.
Fresh
Let's say you're at Burning Man, and you
Yeah.
probably take it between 6 and 9 p.m., maybe as late as midnight, and then you may eat something before you go to bed.
Yeah, I just think that that varies so much, but it depends if you want to get grounded. But are there foods with tryptophans in them, bananas, things like that? I mean, if you're taking supplements, I think just generally healthy would be good.
Okay. Now, I have a question. It's kind of not, I don't know why it's a political question. It should be a science question. Why on earth does the FDA have any standing, considering the fact that they've classified so many medicines as Schedule 1 narcotics, when that just patently false based upon scientific research? Why isn't classification of psychedelics as 2 or 3 or 4? Why isn't that just an immediate, oh, well, there's multiple research papers on the benefit? Like, cannabis is still a Schedule 1. How on earth is that possible when it's approved medically in almost every single state, and there's thousands of research papers? So how does the FDA have any standing, and why on earth is it just listen, here's data, here's a pile of data, government, make the right decision, and then we'll regulate it?
Okay, so there's an easy answer to that, which is that first off, the DEA is what does the scheduling. Once it becomes a medicine, then FDA works with DEA to figure out the new schedule. But the important point is, what is the standard of proof required for currently accepted medical use to get out of Schedule 1, which is no, it doesn't mean that they're saying it has no medical use. It has no currently accepted medical use. And the only way you get off of Schedule 1 is through these phase 3 studies that like MAPS is doing with MDMA, and others will be doing with psilocybin. So you could give them a pile of data, but if it's not the right kind of data from the right kind of studies that were approved by the FDA before you started the study, it doesn't count. So cannabis has actually never been to phase 3 studies. Extracts have. Epidiolex, CBD for childhood epilepsy, Marinol, which is THC for nausea control for cancer chemotherapy, or appetite stimulation. These things are extracts that have been approved, and then for those uses, they're moved out of Schedule 1. But the plant itself has never been in phase 3 studies. And, that's one of our goals too. We're very interested in doing that. The state of Michigan, that when they approved marijuana legalization, some friends of ours from Marijuana Policy Project put in some one paragraph language that they have to spend $40 million, $20 million a year for 2 years on research with cannabis for veterans, mental health, and to reduce veteran suicides. And Michigan has now legalized marijuana. They've made a bunch of tax money. So we're preparing a protocol. We're going to ask for $10 million in the first year to do a big study with marijuana for PTSD in vets. but it's just a phase 2 study. It's not even a phase 3 study. So even if we get great results, it's not proof the way the FDA needs to see proof.
No, thank you for that distinction. That's news to me. So MDMA is, though, helpful with PTSD.
Well, that's what we're trying. We're in phase 3 with MDMA for PTSD, but it's not proved. We have not proved it yet, and we will only prove it after 2 phase 3 studies. So if our first phase 3 study, which I said we're going to get the results at the end of September, if that study is statistically significant, we have still not proved it to the satisfaction of the FDA to get it rescheduled. We have to do another one to replicate it.
Because I have some friends who are very intelligent who are not anti-psychedelics, but they're skeptical. And some of them work in veterans associations. I'd love to be like, look, you like data, here's data, good news. You know, people, I know that there's good data on psilocybin and PTSD with veterans, but
No, there's not.
I thought Paul Stamets presented some good data on the benefit of PTSD. No, is that, am I misremembering?
I haven't seen it, not from controlled studies. I mean, there are people that are starting to look at psilocybin for PTSD. But I think the MDMA is more effective than psilocybin for PTSD. We'll have to see. But I think ideally, again, in the future, what we're trying to do is psychedelic psychotherapy, so that you may get 2 MDMA sessions for PTSD, and then you may get a psilocybin session, or we'll customize these things. It's not like, but we see great results from MDMA. I think the fear reduction part is really important. And the first use of a psychedelic for PTSD was a Dutch psychiatrist, Dr. Bastiaans, and it was starting in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It was for what he called concentration camp syndrome, for people that had been in the concentration camps. And he used LSD. There's a tremendous book, if people want to read it, called Shaviti, 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 A Vision. And it's about an Israeli survivor of the Holocaust, who's a Holocaust writer, who went for LSD therapy for PTSD in the Netherlands and wrote a book about his sessions. And there wasn't, he made a lot of progress, but he was also unable to go further because the fear was too great about certain things. So I'm not aware of any really studies of psilocybin for PTSD that's been published yet. There are vets going down to Peru and Brazil for ayahuasca for PTSD. It's quite helpful. Ibogaine has been used for PTSD. I think psilocybin and LSD can be helpful for PTSD. But right now, the only psychedelic in the world in phase 3 is MDMA for PTSD.
Thank you. What do you think about combining, you mentioned this just briefly, combining LSD and MDMA, something that's called candy flipping, in the kind of the more of the recreational use of it. What do you think as far as the beneficial impact of combining those?
Well,
those
again, it's the drugs are one thing, but the context is more important. So, if you take it in a supportive way, if you take it with knowledgeable people, you can make incredible progress. And different people combine LSD and MDMA in different ways. The approach that I prefer is to start with the LSD and then 3-4 hours later take the MDMA, something like that. So the idea is that you have the hard part first, and then the MDMA kind of smooths the integration. If you take the MDMA first, you kind of come on the LSD when it's softer. It's still valuable. It's still really good. Some people like that. Some people take them both at the same time. But personally, I just like LSD first, and then a few hours later, the MDMA.
No, I've heard the MDMA can help prevent a bad trip, because there's that period with LSD where maybe it's an hour or two in and it's kind of spiking up, and it can get a little intense, and there might be a little fear, a little anxiety. And I've heard that the MDA can help temper that because you are feeling so good. So it kind of takes the edge off of the potential difficulty of the LSD journey.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that's very right.
Do you have any thoughts on ketamine from a therapeutic standpoint? I know ketamine therapy, I read about that in a magazine, and that seems to be something that's kind of approved.
It is approved. So ketamine has been approved for depression, for treatment-resistant depression. And it can be very helpful. And there's ketamine clinics. There's over 100 ketamine clinics all over America right
Hey, what's your thoughts on ketamine? You think that's a beneficial thing for people to use for depression?
now. I think well, again, we've got a pharmaceutical company that has approved it without therapy. So I think pharmacologically it can be helpful, but is more effective when paired with psychotherapy. And I think then you need less ketamine, so the pharmaceutical company sells you less ketamine, which they don't like, but ketamine combined with psychotherapy can be very effective. Ketamine without psychotherapy can also be very effective. The reason that it was even discovered was because of a lot of anesthesiologists started noting that they had patients that were depressed. They gave them ketamine for anesthesia, and then when they sort of near the end of the operations, they're done and they come through this psychedelic phase, and then people started saying they were less depressed. And that caused this whole new area of research. So it's kind of a rapid acting antidepressant, and I think it can be quite effective. And the ketamine is what's really generating psychedelic clinics. It's the only legal thing right now, and so now there's all sorts of businesses that are talking about networks of psychedelic clinics and starting with ketamine. And they will eventually sort of move beyond that to, including being cross-trained with MDMA and psilocybin.
Rick, thank you so much. This has been tremendous. Thank you for enduring the intellectual assault of the endless questions coming your way, and working without notes, and just we so appreciate your genius, your expertise. If anyone would like to unmute or turn your camera on and say thank you to Rick, and just a deep, heartfelt thank you for committing your life's work.
Thank you.
To helping us.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick.
Long live Rick!
Okay, thank you for having me, and I hope the rest.
May you
of
get your
friends
30 million within another 5 months.
That is our big challenge. That is going to be our big challenge. Another 30 million, and then globalizing MDMA. Yeah, we're working with people in South Africa, Somaliland, all over the place. So if we can really do that, we'll be able to heal trauma.
I think that you should take the energy that you have from today and make a video asking for $30 million, and all of us on the call can agree to post it on social media, and I bet you'll get it.
Rick Doblin. I'm going to sign him off, and then I'm going to come check your mic. Is that cool?
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you for that.
Sorry, I wasn't muted there. I apologize.
Okay, I'll say we're waiting for October. We want to make sure that our first phase 3 study for FDA was statistically significant. Then we ramp up the fundraising for the rest of the world. So that's our plan.
Well, I live in a city with thousands of people with PTSD, broken, walking around like zombies in Santa Monica.
Wow.
And I can think of nothing that would make the saddest aspect of our cities than you being able to fix PTSD in a mass scalable way. So please, I wish you the best success.
Yeah, and I'll just add that what we really need for that is drug policy reform, so that people can sort of peer support, and because we'll be scaling the number of therapists is going to be a challenge, but we need both scaling numbers of therapists and also drug policy reform.
I have a friend who's an advisor to the Biden campaign, and I worked for the Obama-Biden White House. If you would write me up what the policy you want and what a speech would be from Biden, I will give it to one of Biden's speechwriters, also a speechwriter for Eric Garcetti and Bill de Blasio, and maybe it'll get read. I made a drug speech before, but unfortunately it was read by Donald Trump.
Oh, God. Well, if you could send me an email at rick@maps.org
Okay.
about that, then I can reply. That would be really good.
Okay, sure, we'll do.
Thank you. Okay.
Now, Rick, we have Lucian Tarnowski coming in here. He wanted to say hello to you. You're the celebrity that all the other speakers want to say hi to. This is just great. So he'll be logging in here in a moment. I have to tell you, you are a hero around our Camp Mystic. We love data. We love science. We love helping people. We love great art and great music. And it's so great to have to have you here at our speaker series sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure. Yeah, we're trying to make do with virtual Burning Man, and it's pretty good.
Do you want to say hi to Rick?
I did.
Fabulous. Okay, we're waiting for Lucian to come in here. Anyone else who want to say anything to Rick, or if there's anything else you'd like to share while we're waiting for Lucian to log in?
Or if Rick hasn't asked of the audience.
Or if Rick, if you have an ask of the audience, if there's some way we can help you without, directly selling us something, which is for the game here. Aside from that, is there something we can do to help you on your mission in life?
Yes.
Great. Tell us.
Yes. So the thing that we look at, what is one of the most successful social change movements of the last decade? Gay marriage and gay rights. And the way that worked is because of people coming out. And I think that's been really key. And so I would say for everybody here, if to the extent that you feel comfortable, come out to your parents, come out to your friends about the value of psychedelics, come out to people that you think are scared of psychedelics. That's what's really going to change things, is that sort of psychedelic coming out. And so everybody can do that. Everybody has a community in which they could share some stories. So I'd say just be a little bit bolder and a little bit more vocal about what these substances have done for you.
See, now, Rick, I'm a bit concerned that the government is going to find a way to search me illegally based upon my public profession that I've taken illegal psychedelic medicine. That's maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe I don't know, but that's a concern for me that could be used against me to hurt me.
Yeah, well, I think that's mostly not likely to happen because they're very busy with opiate overdoses, and also when you say something, there's no proof, right? You say, "Oh, I've done all these drugs," and but where's the proof? How do they get a search warrant? They can't really. So, I think people are safer than they realize about telling their own stories.
Thank you.
But you mainly have to worry about reputational risk. I would say it's not so much legal risk, but reputational risk in whatever communities you're part of.
So as long as I'm working with cool people.
Yeah,
thank you.
Then you're fine.
Really helpful.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Rick. Lucian just got on the call. He wanted to say hello.
Rick, hello, Rick. How are you doing?
Hi, pretty good.
Good to see you. Last time we meet in 2030 again.
Yes. Before then, again, I hope.
Yeah, exactly. No, so we Sky, Rick and I were in Davos together this year, and
you were where?
We were in Davos.
The World Economic Forum.
The World Economic Forum. And Rick took people into 2030. Basically, we've got this we do time porting into the future, which is actually a good place for me to start my talk in a bit later. But Rick did the most epic futurecast from 2030, basically giving the entire psychedelic he basically declared the future and the roadmap for each year, milestones that we're going to hit along the way. And it's pretty epic to have a roadmap, to be honest. So
yeah, and so far I'd say we're on track. I mean, COVID has slowed us down a bit, but overall I think we're more or less on track.
Yeah.
COVID's gotten you to speak at our virtual Camp Mystic, which is going out to thousands, potentially millions of people. So there's a benefit to this.
Yeah.
And we'd love to have you on the Camp Mystic stage next year and years to come to talk about this on the physical stage in the actual camp. I'd be
glad to do that. And also I'll just say that COVID has really increased people's understanding of how much stress and trauma there is in the world. And yes. So it's really increased the appreciation for the need for these new therapies. So, and it's also increased our sense of interconnectedness. That slide I showed about global warming or COVID, better to do it with psychedelics. But the upside is we are all connected, and people see that now more than ever.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rick. It's an absolute pleasure to have spent 2 full hours with you. And I know everyone listening feels super gifted to have this time. So thank you for your work in the world again from all of us.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah. Okay, more to come.